My fellow Americans, welcome to the Celluloid President, the podcast about American presidents on film. Today we're discussing Nixon, Oliver Stone's 1995 would-be masterpiece about our 37th president.
You, Richard Milhouse Nixon.
I, Richard Milhouse Nixon, do solemnly swear
that you will faithfully execute the office
that I will faithfully execute the office
of President of the United States.
of President of the United States.
I'm Gary Holmes, and I'm here with Jim Robinson, who has never gotten over the fact that his old man wasn't rich enough to buy him the presidency. Jim, how you doing?
Well, let me make this perfectly clear. I'm doing fine, Gary.
Okay, all right. So, Richard Milhouse Nixon, he was kind of the reason that we became friends in the first place. And you and I have been talking about him for as long as we've been friends. And that is, I hate to say this, 50 years. When I did the math after watching this movie, I felt really, really old.
So did I. And you're right, Gary. We were freshmen in college during the campaign of 1972, which was Richard Nixon's reelection campaign. And to put it mildly, we were slightly outnumbered on campus among the students, and even more so among the professors.
Well, I remember, I remember our joint friend, our mutual friend, Keith Block, was the canvasser in my dorm. And he came in and he wanted to make sure that I was registered to vote and was planning to vote for McGovern. And I said, no, I wasn't. He was like shocked. Apparently, it was only 3 people in the dorm that were not voting for McGovern that year.
Yeah, that's right. And it was quite a chortling time for us in November when Nixon won in a landslide. Little did we know that the other side would be chortling about 12 to 16 months later.
Before we get to college, though, I just want to say that the election of 1960 is actually one of my earliest, probably the earliest political memory. I have a very distinct memory of the next day being very upset that Nixon was not going to contest ask for a recount in Texas and Illinois, which the Democrats had stolen. So Nixon goes way back to the beginning of my memory.
Well, same here. In fact, you mentioned the campaign of 1960. That was my first campaign at age 6. I walked hand in hand with my father through our suburban New York City neighborhood, handing out literature for Nixon. I remember, debating with my fellow classmates in first grade about who would be the better president, Nixon or Kennedy. And I made my case on the grounds that certainly Nixon was better looking than Kennedy. So it's a campaign that we literally cut our teeth on, didn't we?
Yeah, well, I mean, my baby teeth. So we were not friends freshman year. They call it first year now, by the way. So freshman year. But we did become friends sophomore year, which was when things were starting to go downhill. It was really the two of us fighting a rearguard battle on campus and in our lives against the Nixon haters, who were legion.
It was a painful period. I remember during the summer of 74, which was sort of the resignation and the smoking gun tape and all that kind of thing. And how the Republican Party was predicted to be finished. And you and I think we spent some time, I think I came to visit you and we went to Walden Pond.
Right, I remember that.
Where Henry David Thoreau lived sort of for a year. And
Two.
We were just sort of commiserating and depressed with each other. But I want to say, before I ever arrived at Middlebury, in the summer of 72, I was one of those they called YVPs, Young Voters for the President. Remember, 1972 was the first year that 18-year-olds could vote. And that meant you and I could vote for the first time. And we, the Nixon people really pulled out all the stops. They weren't going to cede the young vote to the Democrats. And I got flown down to Miami where the convention was being held, along with others. All expenses paid by the Nixon campaign. It was the first time I'd ever been on an airplane, by the way, and went down to Miami, and they had a whole bunch of events for us. I remember engaging one on one for a couple minutes with John Ehrlichman. That's where I met Ambassador George Bush and shook hands with Pat Nixon, John Wayne. They were really pulling out all the stops. And some people may remember that infamous outdoor rally where Sammy Davis Jr. Was on stage and Nixon came on stage and Sammy Davis Jr. hugged Nixon. And that picture was in papers all over the country. But when Nixon walked into that outdoor amphitheater, he walked right down the aisle where I was sitting and I got to shake his hand.
So this movie actually gave me flashbacks because I remember living through this period extremely vividly. And I know that you did too. So I assume that you were the first in line to see this movie when it came out in 1995. What can you tell us about the movie?
Well, I was the first in line, and as it turned out, I was one of the only people in line. It was not exactly a box office hit, but I did go to see it in the theater. And it came out in 1995, as you said, a year after Nixon died. Retrospectively, it's been called part of a trilogy of films that Oliver Stone made about American presidents. He made JFK in 1991, Nixon in 1995, and then much later, W, about George W. Bush. So this was the second. And it opens as you'd expect it to, with Watergate. They reenact the break-in, and then they flash forward to December 73, when the scandal of Watergate was really engulfing Nixon. He was sitting, in a darkened room with a few too many scotches under his belt and listening to tapes and getting visited by Al Haig, who brought more tapes. And that's how the movie starts. But then it quickly goes to a series of flashbacks. And the flashbacks are reenactments of it, basically every stage of Nixon's life and career, from childhood, the poorer than dirt childhood, to his meeting Pat, to being on the football team, and then getting involved in politics, becoming vice president, losing to Kennedy in 60, losing the governorship of California in 62, a few years out of politics as a lawyer, and then as president, of course. And then the presidential years are focused mostly on Vietnam and China and Russia, and of course, Watergate. And the film ends, interestingly enough, after going through Nixon's life and his career and flashing forward and flashing back. It ends with his leaving the White House, his resignation. And as soon as he steps out of the door of the White House, the film reverts to the real Nixon. So it's no longer the actors, it's footage of Nixon himself walking with the Fords to the helicopter and leaving. And then as kind of a postscript, genuine footage from Nixon's funeral. And so basically that's the sweep of things. And what the important thing about the film, I think, is not just that it's about Nixon. It's really about these decades of which Nixon played such a big part. And I'm sure, you probably found, like I did, that it was very evocative, not only about Nixon, but about everything having to do with the protest movements of the 60s, the counterculture, all the upheavals right into the 70s.
Right. So you mentioned that it was a bomb, which it was. It only grossed $13.7 million at the box office. It did get 4 Oscar nominations, so it was, had garnered some respect. Just for comparison's sake, the top movies of 1995 were Batman Forever, which grossed 184 million, Apollo 13, Toy Story, Pocahontas, and Ace Ventura. So I think Nixon was maybe listed at the 100th something like that. Some really far down as top grossing
Yeah,
movies.
but I think the appeal is kind of limited. First of all, it's 3 hours and 11 minutes long, and that's a long time for an audience to sit for a biopic. Um, it was respected pretty much by the critics. I think Rotten Tomatoes had a composite score of 75. And so it got good critical reviews. It got, 4 Oscar nominations for for two of the actors, for the music by John Williams, of course, he's everywhere, and for the screenplay.
Yeah.
So all in all, I think it was well received, except by the fans.
I can't remember whether I saw it or not. How many times have you seen it?
Well, I saw it in the theater once,
Right.
and that was an interesting experience because the person I saw it with did not know much about Nixon at all. And especially during the scenes of his really decrepit childhood and the unlikely history of him being able to become president. Um, my friend kept whispering, is that right? Did that happen? And I would say, yes, that's the truth.
Well, can I tell you what surprised me about this movie?
Yeah.
I think maybe I did see it. I can't remember. I'm pretty sure I did see it, but yeah, a lot of it was fresh. You know, the thing that surprised me most about the movie was that it's basically a horror movie. It's got scary music, a lot of dark, rainy days, haunted mansion behind an iron fence. You know, it's really creeped out and they make Nixon's the monster, but he's like the monster in Frankenstein, where he's a figure of pity and sympathy who inadvertently ends up killing a lot of people. And so a lot of these quotes are like, drive it home. Howard Hunt says, "He's the darkness reaching out in the dark. Open up that scab and you uncover a lot of pus."
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I
I
mean,
actually,
did it strike you as being a horror movie?
well, I didn't think of it in those terms, although I certainly remember those images of the thunder and lightning, and then the fence around the White House being sort of the camera angle portrayed that as if Nixon were in prison, which is where a lot of people thought he should be. And riderless horses and forces that nobody could control. And so, yeah, I guess, and I'm thinking of the exchange with Mao Zedong, where Mao, who was clearly intended to be brain addled at that point, but could speak truth through his dementia, would say things like, I have to kill a lot of Chinese to feed a hunger in me, and you have to kill a lot of Vietnamese to feed a hunger in you. So
Well,
there
this
were
is
things, there were gothic, monstery things like that. But I would qualify that by saying that I think we're actually left with a kind of a nuanced portrait of Richard Nixon. He's not all bad in this film. Neither is he all good. I think he's portrayed in part as a victim. He's portrayed in part as a Shakespearean tragic figure, and many times even a sympathetic figure. So if somebody's looking for a leftist filmmaker doing a total evisceration of Richard Nixon, I don't think they're going to be satisfied.
well, I just want to talk about just make one more point about the horror movie aspect of it. Just speaking, since you mentioned that Mao scene, that actually that's some of that actually. This is a trick that Oliver Stone does, where he takes something that actually happened, a well-known event, well-known quotes, and then twists it. So, at that meeting, Mao actually did say, "I voted for you," and Nixon said that he voted for the lesser of two evils. Mao's actual response to that was, "I like rightists, right? Like I like De Gaulle, I like Heath, whatever." But the screenwriters have him say, you're as evil as I am. Others pay to feed the hunger in us. I mean, that's like a very horror movie kind of thing to say.
Right. There are other good examples of what you're talking about where um, it begins with the germ of a truth, something actually from a tape, something that's been pretty well documented in all the Nixon folklore. The scene where Nixon is sort of sadly says, to Al Haig, in your profession, they just give them a pistol and leave the room. I don't have a pistol, Al. Well, that supposedly really did happen.
Right.
And there are other examples like that as well.
Right. Right. The other thing that surprised me about the movie was how overt an homage it was to Citizen Kane, which is Orson Welles' story about William Randolph Hearst. It's the way he tells it. He has all these tricks where he's using stock footage, flashbacks, newsreels, psychotherapy, all these tricks. And he even has this scene where Nixon and Dick and Pat are having dinner at the same table, like way far apart, which is a direct shot from Citizen Kane. Now, Citizen Kane is famously starts off being somewhat sympathetic to to Hearst or Charles Foster Kane, and then ends up again having him be a little bit of a monster. So I think you're right that it's a more nuanced portrait than we would expect from someone like from Oliver Stone. Ultimately, I don't think he succeeds in being as nuanced as he thinks he is, but we can talk about that later.
Yeah, on the sort of the Citizen Kane things that you mentioned, I'd add one more, and I don't think this was done in Citizen Kane. Maybe it was, but it's been done in subsequent movies a lot, like Forrest Gump, where Anthony Hopkins as Nixon would appear in grainy black and white, old-looking footage next to genuine historical figures. So when there was some snippets from the Kennedy-Nixon TV debate in 1960, you would see everything that like it looked in reality, except it would be Hopkins' head, not Nixon's. But the real John Kennedy would be there talking back and forth.
Yeah, I think the problem we have with him being this supposedly being nuanced is that the elements where it's supposed to be sympathetic, he's still it still has that eerie horror movie-ish feel to it. Like when his childhood is black and white, but it feels like a very scary childhood. You would never think that anything nice ever happened to Dick when he was a little boy. And supposedly his mother was very sympathetic, but not in this movie. I mean, she's controlling and psychologically damaging to him.
Well, that sort of gets us. I'd rest some of my case on the nuanced portrait on something we usually talk about in these podcasts, which is what's the filmmaker trying to accomplish.
Right.
And Stone had bigger fish to fry than just talking about whether Richard Nixon was good or bad. And the bigger fish to fry were twofold. One, there's always a habit, especially among the left, to make former Republican presidents look better in comparison with subsequent or current Republican presidents. It's like, well, we can have respect for that person now that he's gone. And secondly, and this is a direct carryover from the JFK film, which at some point I'm sure we'll do a podcast on, is that there are worse villains in Oliver Stone's mind than Richard Nixon. And it gets into the whole arena of the deep state. He doesn't call it the deep state in this or the JFK movie. It's called the beast in Nixon. It's a set of forces, a set of institutions that have this behind the scenes control over everything, over even presidents of the United States.
Right.
And so part of the theme here and what he's trying to accomplish is that Nixon, sure, was done in by his own shortcomings and wrongdoing, but he was helped mightily along the way by a set of institutions and forces, centered around the spy agencies, the military industrial complex, the extreme right wing, who didn't want Nixon to succeed in opening up China or in detente with Russia, and didn't want him to do some of the more moderate things that Nixon wanted to do, like expand national health care, eventually cut forces in Europe, and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, no, I agree with you that what what Oliver Stone's trying to accomplish is to continue this narrative of the United States government being one big conspiracy against the people. It's kind of a really, I haven't seen JFK, which I'm, as you're right, we'll be talking about, but I assume that it's a sequel to that. He's trying to continuing to try and prove that JFK wasn't killed by Lee Harvey Oswald, but it was part of a grand scheme. And he has Nixon being enmeshed in this somehow, which I think is kind of preposterous. As far as I can tell, Nixon was not part of any attempt to kick Castro out, which then snowballed into Castro and the mafia and the and the right and the CIA killing Kennedy. I mean, that whole thing. But I think he's doubling down on this whole conspiracy thing and trying to say, well, I was right in JFK because here's what happened when, Nixon proves it too.
Yeah, and just to make sure that the listeners understand the theory, it's just a theory of Stone's. It's basically that as vice president, Nixon chaired a special operations group or was somehow deeply involved in what was a fact, which is that there were US inspired, CIA inspired coups and black ops in a number of third world countries, in pursuit of our fight against communism, and also in Stone's telling to serve American business interests. And Nixon was involved in those, says Stone, and yet it became this organic phenomenon, this group, this behind the scenes, budgets weren't public, it was all part of a CIA operation that eventually morphed or mutated into the assassination of John Kennedy. And Nixon, supposedly in his involvement in the Watergate cover-up, was not so much worried about covering up the bugging, who ordered the bugging of the Watergate, but he was very much concerned about covering up all of the previous activities from when he was vice president, and also some of the activities like breaking into Ellsberg's office, the psychiatrist's office of Daniel Ellsberg, some of those activities. And so that's the theory. And that Nixon, when he found out that a bunch of the Watergate burglars were the same people that were involved in some of the CIA operations, black ops from the early 60s and late 50s, to him, that was case closed. They had to be paid. It had to be all covered up. And so I think that's the theory working here.
Right. So let's talk about the movie itself a little bit more. Part of what makes the movie rise or fall is the acting. Let's start with the acting.
Right.
And before we talk, let's maybe leave Anthony Hopkins to the end because really the movie kind of rises and falls on him. But what did you think about some of the other? I mean, these people seem like for you and me, they're like part of the family. I mean, all these characters, we see them on TV so much, we've read their bios, we've saw them being interviewed. I mean,
Listen to their tapes.
listen to their tapes exactly. Yeah, I think you've listened to more tapes than I have.
Right.
What did you like? Who did you think did the best impersonation? Who did the worst impersonation?
Sure. Well,
let's do one at a time. Like, tell
sure.
me who your
And I'll
first.
give pluses or minuses with the predicate that some of the ones I'm going to say were worse was because how the characters were written and
Right.
not necessarily
Not
their
right. We're not
acting.
necessarily talking about the acting,
Right. But
although how they
Paul
looked, I
Sorvino,
think, goes into it too. Yeah.
right.
Go
Paul
ahead.
Sorvino as Henry Kissinger had the easiest job
Right.
because there's no accent and voice in public life easier to imitate than Henry Kissinger.
Right.
And so I thought he did an excellent job with that guttural, the guttural accent, but also with the sort of semi-intellectual, semi-crazed look that would come across his eyes when he was speaking different lines. So I thought I'd give Paul Sorvino as Henry Kissinger a plus.
Yeah, I would say so too, except I would except for one thing. I mean, you're right about the he's a little bit of of a figure of humor, because he's always quitting and threatening to quit, and especially at the end there, where he's in with Nixon when they're praying, which is totally happened.
Yeah.
Nixon on the last day of his presidency asked Kissinger to get down on his knees, but the way is like, he's like, "Is this going to leak?" I thought it was. It didn't he didn't seem like the real serious figure that he actually is. I mean, he's still writing books. He's like 90,
He's
95
still
years old.
alive. He's pushing 100.
He's a better writer than I am.
Well, the
All
other
right.
thing I'd say is I think Stone and his screenwriters really had it in for Kissinger, and which would fit because if anybody would be part of that permanent, foreign policy establishment, it would be Kissinger. But remember what a point was made of Kissinger was the one that pushed to get back at Ellsberg. And then when Nixon popped off on the Sequoia one night and said, maybe I'll have to drop the big one on Vietnam, and the Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Ziegler and Mitchell were horrified. But there's Henry the K chiming in with sort of ass kissing. Well, it may be something we have to consider. So I think they were really, I think the filmmakers had it in for Kissinger.
All right. I thought my vote for best impersonation, and I think you might not agree with this, is Pat Nixon. Joan Allen. I've never actually. I have no idea what she sounds like, so I can't swear that she did a good impersonation or not. But I thought she looked the part. She seems to play a role as the conscience of the movie, the only one who tells Nixon what he doesn't want to hear. But there is a lot of, like she's going to divorce him, and then she's like, well, no, I'm going to run. I'm going to stand behind you if you want to run. And so I thought she seemed real to me.
Yeah, I thought she did an excellent job, especially since she was still in her, I think, late 30s, and Pat Nixon was pushing 60 for most of this film. So if you look at, and we're able, because we've seen the real Pat Nixon so much, we're able to compare. I thought particularly her head gestures, the way she tilted her head upward and her hand gestures, the sort of brittleness that Pat Nixon portrayed. I thought she did an excellent job. I think in terms of the role she was playing and the role that the Pat Nixon character played in the film, I think was definitely a mixed bag. She blew hot and cold. Sometimes she was the most supportive person of all for Richard and the most sympathetic. And other times she was downright nasty, absolutely mean. And you and I have a friend who was in the Nixon White House, and I happened to talk to him shortly after the film came out. And what bothered the Nixon inner circle after the film came out more than the imaginative retelling of Nixon's career in politics or in the presidency was the portrayal of Pat Nixon and the portrayal um, of their relationship.
And why is that? Because he
Well, for one thing, they said Nixon never even called her buddy.
okay.
Now I don't know the truth there, but that was and so there was this common refrain of a nickname that apparently, according to some, was never used. But secondly, she was always smoking, which she did. She was a smoker. Um, Always tipsy, often tipsy, as Nixon was. So, and she was actually referencing sex a number of times when she tried to come on to Nixon sexually in one scene. And Nixon said, "Well, I'm no Jack Kennedy." And she goes, "Yeah,
I don't need that. Yeah.
yeah." I mean, stuff like that it is claimed that Pat Nixon would never have done.
It's hard to know. I mean,
Right.
you remember famously that in the final days, I think it is, where she supposedly told Liz Carpenter that they hadn't had sex in 15 years or something. So, and
Yeah.
then Nixon then returned and tried to blame that on why she had a stroke because,
Right.
you know,
Yeah.
the Woodward and Bernstein gave her a stroke by reporting that.
Mhm.
I thought that James Woods as H.R. Haldeman was good. I thought it was, Haldeman has possibly the greatest flat top in American history. I don't know how he managed to get that hair like that, but so I believed him in that movie, and he looked like him. I thought though that they made him really anti-Semitic and racist, which I don't, he may have been, but I don't think he would have said those things. And I was surprised. I was surprised. I have to tell my wife this. He grew up in Warwick, Rhode Island, which is where she grew up. So, um, so he's the pride of Warwick, Rhode Island.
Yeah, I thought James Woods did a great job. I'm not sure how accurate the portrayal was. He had Haldeman being probably a little more jocular and humorous than maybe Haldeman really was, um, and almost playing for comedic effect in a number of on a number of occasions. Um, but I think he was a really important figure in the movie. Um, that loyalty mixed with some political smarts, mixed with the palace guard element. I just thought I thought he did an excellent job. I've met H.R. Haldeman, and there was a seriousness to the demeanor um, that I thought wasn't entirely captured in Wood's portrayal. Haldeman was a Christian Scientist and died in his mid 60s of cancer after refusing any kinds of treatments.
Okay.
I believe he was a total teetotaler. And yet there's a scene or two in the film where he and Nixon are downing scotches together. So I think that there was some imagination there, but Woods did a great job.
So before we get to some of the bad impersonations, and I only have a couple, is there any other one else you want to call out?
Well, yeah, I think E.G. Marshall was great as John Mitchell.
Mm-hmm.
Um, John Mitchell, the hand gestures I remember in particular, the sort of sweeping a flat hand facing down, sweeping it back and forth while making a point. I remember specifically Mitchell, the real Mitchell, making those kind of gestures. It's unlikely when you look at pictures of the real John Mitchell, but he was sort of a ladies' man. And there's some of that in E.G. Marshall's portrayal, and there was sort of the toughness combined, element there. He was the one that was talking about, stick with your course, stay your course in Vietnam, don't cut and run. Yeah, feel sorry for the students shot at Kent State, but don't forget the soldiers we're kids too, and you're doing the right thing, stick with it. He was tough like that.
Yeah.
And then also in being unrepentant about Watergate. All that's real.
I thought that in terms of bad impersonation, David Hyde Pierce as John Dean was just way, way off.
I
Um,
did too.
Dean was much better looking, and not as innocent as portrayed here. David Hyde Pierce was Niles Crane on Frasier, and it just too effete in general for this. So I thought it was just it was off. It didn't look like him, it didn't sound like him, it didn't act like him.
Well, yeah, I agree. And let me lump that him together with J.T. Walsh as Ehrlichman and David Paymer as Ziegler.
Yeah, I
And
was gonna I have Paymer
yeah,
down
and
as well.
I would put these three in the category of very capable actors whose parts were not written that realistically. And here's maybe a reason. Those three were portraying people that were still alive when the film was made. Ehrlichman in particular was threatening lawsuits. And he was portrayed by J.T. Walsh, I think, almost totally opposite the way Ehrlichman really was. Many of the people, the insiders, loved Bob Haldeman. Forget what the press says about these different characters, but they thought Ehrlichman was the real Machiavellian, and that he was the real tough guy, cynical guy, also very biting humor
Right,
guy.
right.
But Ehrlichman in the film comes across as the conscience, if you will. Is this legal? Should we do this?
Well, he's barely
Maybe,
in it either.
yeah, maybe we should have a day of prayer for the Kent State students. That's not John Ehrlichman. And then David Paymer as Ziegler, they just portrayed Ziegler as like a stutterer, an idiot, total idiot stutterer with no political skills, no articulateness. And that's not the case. I'm not saying he was the greatest intellect or the best press secretary, anything like that. But he was a substantial figure who, in the last months and even in the months after the resignation, was a serious advisor to the president of the United States. So, and I thought Pierce, they tried to make him be out too much of a Boy Scout. And guess who was a consultant to this film?
Right.
John Dean.
Two other characters I want to single out for special attention because of their humorous effect. Madeline Kahn is Martha Mitchell and Bob Hoskins is J. Edgar Hoover.
Yes.
This is not a
Yeah.
very funny. There's not a lot of humor in the movie, but both of them seem to provide it.
Right. I thought in particular Hoskins was really good. I don't, genuine images and voice of J. Edgar Hoover doesn't stick in my mind like the others, and I'm sure won't be in the minds of most people that watch the movie. But I thought he just played it to the hilt. He was having fun with it. The part was written deliciously for him. He was both ominous and a comic source of comic relief all at the same time. And I thought he did a fabulous job. And then Madeline Kahn was in it very briefly, but yeah, she was, the way she tucked it to Nixon at the famous New York cocktail party, and she was very good.
Yeah. And someone we totally need to mention is Dan Hedaya, who played Trini.
Right.
Only because actually played Nixon in the movie Dick. And
Oh,
I
did
guess
he?
this is supposed to be BB. Trini is
Yes, it's
BB.
supposed to be Bibi Rebozo, who was still alive.
Yeah,
Again, I think this impacted the film maybe more than Stone would want to admit.
right.
Was the legal action when you're portraying real people.
All right. Now, what about Hopkins himself? I mean, he's one of the most well-known, respected actors. He's played. First of all, he's Welch, and he's played a lot of famous characters. In Lion and Winter, he played Richard the First. In Young Winston, he was David Lloyd George. He played Pope Benedict in The Two Popes. He was Captain Bligh in Mutiny and the Bounty. He was John Quincy Adams in Amistad, a movie we probably will do. And of course, he's most famous for Hannibal Lecter.
Right. I thought he was phenomenal. And I know not everybody thinks that. Again, I go with the body movements and the bobbing of the head and he was Nixon. He was really Nixon. His accent slipped a couple times, like when he would say, this is a third-rate burglary. It would be third-rate burglary, like with a kind of a British accent. So sometimes the accent would slip. He had the mannerisms down really well. He was shorter and stouter than Nixon was in real life. So that was a little bit of a drawback. But I thought, and even on the pronouncing, the way Nixon pronounced certain words, the voice inflections, I thought were really good. I think he deserved at least the Oscar nomination that he got for this role.
I thought that he was, it took me a long time to warm up to it because he didn't look like him. He didn't. And when we get through, when we 2 or 3 years from now, when we finish the sequence of podcasts about movie presidents, we can rank the Nixon portrayals in order because there's at least 5 of them that I can think of. But I thought it eventually did grow on me, and you're totally right. The mannerisms were totally there. The way he would smile weirdly with his mouth. I thought that was the thing that bugged me, and this is not his fault. It's Oliver Stone's fault. This whole idea about how he was drunk all the time seems way off. I mean, I don't doubt that he was occasionally drunk, but the idea that he was almost never seen without a glass of scotch in his hand.
Right. It's pretty well documented that he would get, affected by alcohol. John Ehrlichman said that Nixon's problem was that it would only take one drink. And it's not that he sat there and downed a fifth of scotch every night. It's just it wouldn't take much. And so, yeah, I think that they overdid that a little bit. But if we're going to think about Hopkins' portrayal, we have to think about who were the others suggested to play the part. And there were some others.
All right,
in
what
fact,
do you got?
The studio wasn't enthused with the choice. Tom Hanks, Warren Beatty was probably the most seriously considered. Warren Beatty was into reading the script. I think he did not an audition, Warren Beatty would never do that, but did a reading and asked for Joan Allen, by the way,
Okay.
To do the reading with. And that's sort of gave the idea to cast Joan Allen as Pat Nixon, Tommy Lee Jones. So they did think about big American stars as possible Nixons. And what I read is that Beatty was kind of the first choice, but Beatty wanted too much script control. And I'm only speculating here. Beatty would probably want a script that would be a Woodward and Bernstein script, with
Right.
just no nuance, no, cardboard cutout villain here.
Well, let's turn to the history itself since we're talking. I mean, what did you think about the accuracy?
Well, first of all, they used some of the tapes, transcripts,
Mm-hmm.
and that was sort of touch and go. So when they had Nixon basically ordering Haldeman to go to the CIA and tell them not to go into this case, period. Don't lie to them. It's for the good of the country. Just say this is a comedy of errors. All that's real. So there were parts of the conversations portrayed in the Oval Office that were definitely historically accurate. Then there were other parts that were rearranged, condensed, or as we spoke about before, they would take one line or one episode or one habit that has been well documented and spin a whole tale around that. But I think in terms of if we're going to look at the history of this, we have to quote verbatim the disclaimer that comes on screen before the movie even starts. And here it is. This film is a dramatic interpretation of events and characters based on public sources and an incomplete historic record. Some scenes and events are presented as composites or have been hypothesized or condensed. He covers a lot of bases in that statement.
Yeah.
And that's what we can say about the movie, I think.
So my take on this is the opposite of what I usually complain about when I see these historical movies. Usually they get the general history right, the overall take right, but they make up all these scenes. But in this case, it's the other way around. There are scenes of things that actually happened, and you're right, they pull from speeches and tapes and interviews. But still, it only adds up to a picture that's about half true. Nixon didn't lose popularity because of the Vietnam War, because of his foreign policy. The draft was over by 1972, as you and I both well know, because we were eligible up until that year. I mean, we were eligible that year, the year that they stopped it. So the Vietnam War, the reason he got impeached had nothing to do with Vietnam. And this is you mentioned this in the beginning. This is all about foreign policy. It's nothing about domestic policy. And we forget now how terrible, really rotten the economy was in 1973 and 74. We had huge inflation. We had the first oil shocks, gas lines, unemployment, a recession, and inflation at the same time. I mean, the economy was in the toilet. And, we had wage and price controls. It was a mess. And none of that is in this movie.
Yeah, I think we're both willing to give the filmmaker a lot of leeway in terms of the specifics, because you're trying to tell a story.
Right.
The real question with this and other movies like it is the narrative true? Or does the narrative ring true? Or is at least a plausible alternative narrative to the commonly accepted narrative? And there were several narratives at work in this film. We've touched on some of them, but that the JFK killing somehow drove Nixon's actions in the Watergate cover-up. How about Nixon's intense survivor guilt, being the middle brother, having lost two brothers at young ages to tuberculosis, and how that drove a lot of Nixon's drive to pursue the presidency, and how the deaths of his two brothers and the deaths of the two Kennedy brothers, as Nixon said in the film at one point, cleared a path through the wilderness. That whole narrative. There's the narrative of Nixon was a good kind of moderate Republican compared to what was before and what came since.
But I don't really see that. That's actually for me one of the weaknesses, because you're right. Nixon was that Nixon was that moderate. He did all kinds of EPA, OSHA, all that thing. He created all those crazy departments, and but you don't see that in the movie at all.
Well, you saw it during his speech,
right? For 2 seconds. I mean, right. There was like 5 seconds and it was like, right. Whoa, what's he talking? What? Right. So I mean, he was a moderate, and you don't see that portrayed at all.
Well, where you see it portrayed is in contrast. And so that gets to two of delicious scenes with your friend and mine, Larry Hagman, as J.R.
Right.
Ewing in Dallas, as Jack Jones in the film, a figure that is believed never really existed. The meetings didn't happen.
Right.
But this is where you have Stone putting forth the idea that Nixon was faced with a lot of right-wing resistance to what he was trying to do. There was some right-wing resistance to what he was trying to do. National Review and William F. Buckley Jr. Regarding Nixon's opening with China were brutal, absolutely brutal to Nixon. So there was more of it than maybe you're remembering. There was also, remember, we had just come off of 1968, where a whole region of the country voted for an avowed segregationist for president, for George Wallace, almost resulting in the election getting thrown into the House of Representatives. There was a quite vocal and resistant extreme right wing in the country. I'm sure it's being exaggerated by Stone, and it's also being melded together with the military industrial complex, with J. Edgar Hoover, with Dick Helms of the CIA. It's all being stirred into one big pot to represent the deep state and the resistance to Nixon. So,
But that the resistance that he shows here is all this this beast resistance, this I've got my interests resistance. You don't really see the intellectual resistance to the extent that, conservative ideological resistance. It's all like, what are my personal interests involved? And with I thought both those scenes without Larry Hagman, were, I thought, ridiculous. I mean, you might believe in conspiracies more than I do, but the whole idea that a bunch of Texas oil men are going to buy the election um, seems far-fetched. If that were the case, John Connally would be president, or Rockefeller. So, and you hear about it today. I mean, people are still saying like, "Oh, the NRA is so powerful that these PACs." The reason the NRA and they're powerful is because they're powerful because they're popular. And this movie doesn't really show you why Nixon was popular. He is incredibly popular as he was. It looks like he's been propped up by these billionaires, and then they bring him down somehow, instead of
right,
like what's actually going on in the world.
right. My theory about where Nixon was clever is as follows: during the 60s and early 70s, which you and I lived through with the counterculture and all that, Nixon was a full-throated patriot in the jingoistic sense and in the real sense. And he was clearly on the side of the middle class, the non-counterculture. He was posed himself against the elites, who he thought were wet noodles succumbing to the counterculture, and he was on the side of the silent majority, as he called them. And that gave him the fervent support from conservative people, from Republicans, from a lot of hard hats. And that gave him the political space he needed to pursue moderate kinds of policies.
So you and I both know that. I'm not sure that comes across in the movie. You don't see him pursuing any moderate policies, and you don't see him. You see who he's against. He's against the elites, the striped, the pointy head types and all that. But it's like it's like he's driven only by resentment and jealousy against the Harvard types.
Well, you see him in foreign policy. You see him arguing with the conservative point of view. You see it in the Larry Hagman scene, where he's trying to say, look, the world's changed. You see it in his in the left on the editing room floor scene, which we'll talk about, with Helms, where he's trying to say, look, this isn't the same world. And then you see him articulate on a couple occasions when Ehrlichman and others are worried about him getting too close to China precisely because of losing conservative support. You see him articulating the reasons for opening China. So I think you're right on domestic policy. Domestic policy moderation is sort of thrown in there. But on the foreign policy, no, he's articulating and debating with people that don't want the change.
So for as long as I can remember, you keep telling me people don't vote because of foreign policy. And yet this whole movie is all about foreign policy, nothing about domestic policy. Anyway, let's switch to our, we've talked about various scenes. What was your favorite scene? Or what are some of your favorite scenes?
Okay, I'll rattle them off.
Yeah, we probably need to start rattling stuff off.
Yeah. First, the scene on the Sequoia right after the Kent State students were shot, and he's having dinner with his top aides. And there I see in that scene the full panoply of of the good and bad sides of Nixon. You see him popping off. You see him being very articulate in laying out his strategy on Russia and China and in Vietnam. You see him being sympathetic and wanting to express condolences to the families of the students that were killed, but he just can't because he can't bring himself to show that kind of emotion. So I really like that scene. I like the two Larry Hagman scenes. I know you didn't, but I just thought they were fun. I love the J. Edgar Hoover scene poolside at a luxury resort where he's simultaneously trying to figure out how to bring Nixon under his control, Nixon, the candidate, while he's sexually harassing the young Latino waiter, who's not unwilling, by the way. I thought the combination of that was fun. I love the New York cocktail party scene when Nixon was out of office. He was a lawyer in New York City where Rockefeller showed up, and he had a little mini debate with Rockefeller about Goldwater, and that's where Margaret Mitchell appeared, and that's where John Mitchell was at his wisest, saying, just make some money, Dick. Let Rocky and Goldwater take the fall against Kennedy in '64. This was before the assassination. And then finally, and this is the scene that did not make the final cut of the movie, supposedly for artistic reasons, but also because the lead player in that scene was threatening lawsuit. And that's the scene with Nixon and Dick Helms, the head of the CIA, played by Sam Waterston in a very effective manner. And I thought that was a remarkable scene. It may be good that it was left out because it almost makes too explicit a lot of the narratives that we've been talking about and a lot of the things that the filmmaker is trying to accomplish. But you get a full explanation there of just what Nixon was so fearful about with with the Kennedy connection. You get the sense of Dick Helms as a really evil man who was basically blackmailing Nixon into increasing the CIA budget, and basically threatening him almost with assassination if he kept pursuing, the course of opening up to China and giving up on getting rid of Castro. Those are my favorite scenes.
All right. So I have a couple. I thought the convention speech was really the highlight of the movie. And I wish that they'd shown more of it because I remember that convention speech very vividly, being a very tremendously patriotic and inspiring speech. I mean, there was a couple good lines in there. I wish there would have been more of that. The last 10 minutes of the movie where they started showing the real Nixon footage, that was the only time during the movie where I was actually kind of choked up and emotional. And I was really like, oh, I'm supposed to have felt this the entire movie. I was supposed to have felt like there was a Shakespearean quality to this, someone who had been a great figure and then had fallen. So it was it's interesting. It took me, I had to see the real Nixon to appreciate what the movie was supposedly trying to get across. I want to talk about the Helms scene again, although I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about a scene that was in a movie that hardly anyone ever saw in the first place too much. But the visit to the Lincoln Memorial stood out. It didn't really work for me. I like the beginning. I mentioned this because I like the beginning when they were playing the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which is a very inspirational but this whole, was bizarre, but not quite bizarre enough. What happened, like when Nixon just sort of goes to the Lincoln Memorial in the middle of the night with Manolo without telling the Secret Service is just insane.
But it happened.
But it happened, yes. And I said it's not crazy enough because what happened after that is then he went up to the White House, went up to the Capitol and tried to, go to his old office and he couldn't get in because the door was locked. So they went into the chamber or something. And, Nixon was up in Manolo or was in the speaker's seat or something like crazy.
Yeah, speaking of unauthorized people.
Yeah, exactly. Manolo could have been persecuted for trespassing. I I thought, but for me, this is it sort of sums up, and you probably like this scene. I don't know this whole idea where the had this girl this exchange with the girl, like you can't stop this, can you? The system won't let you stop it. The CIA, the mafia, it's a beast. I mean, first of all, it never happened, but the articulation. And then he's like, "Oh yeah, the 18-year-old girl understands it better than anyone else." I just do not buy that the system would not let him stop the war because it was ended like 2 years later. He did stop that war.
Right.
And this whole, it is extremely hard. And we're seeing that in Ukraine now. I mean, when a lot of people have lost a lot of lives, and this happened in World War One, especially, millions of people had died, and there was no point in fighting. But they could not bring themselves to have a ceasefire because it would have diminished all the sacrifice that, millions of people have died. And for what? For this? You had to keep fighting until you won. Nixon was able to actually accomplish something that, most leaders can't. And he was able to stop the war. So, I mean, I thought that scene was kind of dumb.
I didn't care for that. I thought the kids looked too well scrubbed.
That's what I thought too. Exactly.
Uh,
Especially when you see you see actual video of these actual, they all look like they just had their hair shampooed and cut to look like hippies and stuff. I mean,
yeah, but I didn't mind the invocation of that theme. Look, I don't take the conspiracy beast, deep state stuff um, totally seriously. I just think it's interesting that he was ahead of his time in evoking it so much and proof positive that this penchant toward uh, big forces and big conspiracies working behind the scenes is an equal opportunity affliction of the left and the right.
yeah, I mean, right. Yeah, I mean, the conspiracies, the first conspiracy I remember was this idea about putting fluoride in the water to poison people or something back in the 50s.
Communist
All right,
plot.
let's talk about the CIA scene. First of all, obviously never would have happened because Nixon couldn't stand the CIA. He never would have gone there. He barely even talked to Helms. This scene implies that Nixon and Helms had been working together for a long time, and as far as I can tell, they barely even knew each other. Nixon might have, and then he wouldn't let Helms come to the CIA, go to being part of the NSC briefings rather. So, and again, I don't. I know that you think it does articulate this theme about the deep state and the beast and all of that, but it just seems so out of the top. And this whole idea of like him calling Nixon Dick twice, like they're old friends or something. I
Well,
never
no,
would
that
have
was a
happened.
sign of disrespect.
I know, and the idea that they held something over him. Again, I know that's
I,
crucial to theme of the movie, but I just don't buy that.
well, remember, Nixon and Helms have both been around Washington a long time by
Yeah.
the time this scene took place. So to me, I mean, Nixon knew everybody and everybody knew Nixon that was, in the upper echelons. And he got there in 46. And so, I don't think that part was implausible. I think this scene, this scene takes on added credibility with age because we are seeing a lot of shenanigans from the CIA in subsequent years and in current times. We are seeing things going on that are beyond the realm of transparency and beyond the realm of being influenceable by our elected representatives. We have seen many notorious examples of either meddling or good intelligence or bad intelligence coming out of the CIA in the subsequent years. There did have to be the whole Frank Church Commission to reform some of the practices. And now the Republicans, in their takeover of the House, are going to launch a new church type commission.
Yeah, but I
So,
think a lot of those a lot of the CIA obviously has a very nefarious reputation and did a lot of weird stuff, but they were always doing it at the direction of the president, not, I don't think they were ever going rogue. Now, I do agree that there's a deep state to the extent that they have institutional interests and they never want to have their budgets cut and they don't want to get into trouble. And there's a lot of blame shifting and all of that kind of stuff. But I don't see them, going to war with the president, except, of course, with Trump, and we're going to try and keep this a Trump-free zone. But up until then, they've mostly been a tool. And Nixon totally did. I mean, he couldn't stand the CIA. I mean, he was ahead of the game on that. And I'm sure I haven't seen W yet, but I'm sure there's a lot of CIA bashing in that movie too. That scene, something that strikes me. I don't know if you know that poem, The Second Coming by Yeats, the idea of the beast slouching towards Bethlehem. The center
I
cannot,
remember a couple of the lines.
yeah,
Yes,
the center cannot hold. I mean,
right. Center cannot hold is a
yeah, Joan Didion wrote a book called Slouching Towards Bethlehem. That Yates wrote that during the Irish Civil War in 1904, and it relates to Revelation, the book of Revelation in the Bible. That's the beast there. So, I mean, it's like a really big image of the beast, rather being even something, it's like totally evil. And those flowers and the image of death and stuff. I mean, Nixon is kind of portrayed as a little bit of a monster in that more than, I mean, it makes it pretty explicit there that who's the beast? I don't know. Is it Nixon or is it the CIA?
Oh, I don't think Nixon was portrayed, I thought, as a monster at all in that scene. I thought he was portrayed as impotent. And he was kind of, he backed down at every chance he was forced to with Helms. And finally, he had no recourse but to say,
I'll increase your
there's
budget and you
something
can
worse than death.
stay and yada,
There's
yada,
some
yada.
things worse than death. There's such a thing as evil. And then they clearly show a close-up of Helms when Nixon said that with his eyes artificially blackened out. No, I thought Nixon was pathetic in that scene.
All right, let's talk about, do you have any favorite lines?
Yes. I thought the scene at the end when Nixon's talking to the portraits and his last night in the White House, and he reaches the portrait of his obsession, John Kennedy.
Right.
And he looks up and he says, referring to the American people, when they look at you, they see what they want to be. When they look at me, they see what they are. And I thought that encapsulates so much of not only Stone's theme, but also something in American history. We love the idea that any boy or girl can grow up to be president. But when you get an average person becoming president, it's not necessarily all heroic. It's some of the qualities that are in us all, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Well,
they're not the noblesse oblige.
I would say that, yes, I would agree with you to only a certain extent. It depends on whether they're Republican or not. Basically, if a rich Democrat is president, that's great. If a poor president is a Democrat, is great. That's great. The other way around, it's terrible. Terrible to have a rich Republican president. It's terrible, a gauche to have a Republican poor guy. I mean, Barack Obama was as, poor as Nixon was.
No, not really. No.
All right. Well, let's
not get into it. But his mother was a six-figure salary, international aid worker.
Okay.
But anyway.
What other line did you like?
Well, I love and this gets to our slight disagreement about the role of Pat Nixon in the film. But when the tapes were discovered, and both Nixon and Pat were in the residence of the White House, and she came in while Nixon was listening to some of the tapes. They were both a little drunk, and Nixon says, "They're mine. No one's going to see these tapes, not even you." And she says in her mean voice, they aren't yours. They are you. You should burn them. To me, that encapsulates the flip side of her supposed dear love and devotion for Dick Nixon. And then I just I'd mention one other fake line, which was during one scene in the Oval Office when Nixon's dog turns away from him. And and Nixon says, "How long have we had this jackass dog? We need a dog that looks good in front of the press." I
Oh,
just thought that
poor King Timoho.
Timoho, yeah. But beyond all that, Gary, I think, and it gets to your point about when you got a little choked up at the end, there were no better lines than Nixon's own lines in his
Right,
farewell speech.
right.
And from the way he described his parents to the way he described how you have to be in deep valleys to know how magnificent it is to be on the mountaintop, and of course the line that's been off quoted as so revealing and making people wonder why he didn't realize it earlier, which was, others may hate you, but if you hate, but it's okay unless you hate them, and then you destroy yourself.
Yeah. No, those are I mean, the lines from that final speech are very memorable, very powerful. I didn't really think that they came across as well in the movie as they do when you watch the actual video, just because
Agreed.
it's hard to re-embody something like that once you've seen it so much, and you've seen what the real thing is. Another couple of lines that I liked, John Mitchell, someone better freshen Martha's drink. I think she's down a quart.
Yeah.
Um, Nixon at one point, they ask him if he likes what kind of music he likes. He says, "I like jazz." Yeah, Guy Lombardo. Um, you know, it's such a square. And this is kind of I mean, I didn't really. It's not a favorite line, but I kind of gasped when Nixon announces that he's going down to Key Biscayne, and she says, "Why can't we go down to Key Biscayne together?" And he says, "Because I need the rest." It's like, what a thing to say to your wife, you know? Oh my God, I felt so bad for her. Did you notice also in that scene where Nixon tells the servant that Mrs. Nixon's going to stay here with Mrs. Eisenhower, and I thought, wait a second, is Mamie Eisenhower there? And no, he's talking about Julie. He's talking about his daughter. He calls his daughter Mrs. Eisenhower. So that was weird. I did also like the jackass dog thing, but you'd already pointed that out to me. What do you think about Oliver Stone in general? Have you seen many of his movies?
Not too many. I saw Midnight Express a long time ago. I saw Heaven and Earth, which is the third of his Vietnam trilogy movies, along with Platoon and Born on the Fourth of July. I saw Wall Street, and I saw The Doors, of course, because of the
Right.
rock
Well,
and
of
roll
course,
angle.
how would we miss that? I saw Platoon, Wall Street, The Doors, Born on the Fourth of July. I think he's actually quite extremely talented director, very effective propagandist.
Yeah, he's got an incredible body of work, and
Yeah,
and an interesting life too. I mean, he volunteered for Vietnam. He was, and not in a cushy position, but in the infantry, was wounded, and a really formidable figure. I really, even without agreeing, with a lot of what he tries to get across, I think he's an incredibly talented person.
I know it's just unfortunate that he's in my mind a nut. But speaking of surprises, there's one surprise that I had that I want to say in general about the movie is that I was surprised at how well it evoked the 60s.
Right.
To me, this is like a better portrayal of the 60s than any other movie I've seen, and including, I mean, movies that are explicitly about the 60s, like Hair or, Mad Men was actually the TV show. Partly it's because they used the actual footage of actual riots back then, and plus all the crazy, deranged, tilted cameras and the black and white. It had that crazy, nightmarish feel to it. I mean, the 60s were a really, really tumultuous, divisive time. People who talk about how divided we are today did not live through the 60s, or if they do, they forgot. I mean, it was a much worse time than today.
Well, there was such a sense of chaos, and and we were teenagers, and we couldn't avoid a lot of it. And we saw huge divisions. We saw also unbelievably fast changes and
Oh,
capitulations,
you
some of
can't.
which I liked, by the way.
Oh,
I
sure.
mean,
Yeah.
in my junior high and high school, we went in one semester from girls couldn't wear slacks to school to all of a sudden we could wear jeans and boys couldn't wear jeans to all of a sudden we could wear bell bottoms with patches all over them and sandals. I mean, it was a time of great division and change, and people are getting killed.
Well, I mean, there were when they had riots back then, you'd kill like, like 10 cops and 60 demonstrators would get killed.
Right.
And there were riots all the time, every summer practically, in city after city.
So it did
There was,
evoke that very well, I thought.
and there were the underground, where they were blowing up buildings and killing, raiding rinks trucks and stuff. I mean, it's like chicken crumbs now, compared to what, yeah.
Yeah.
This is a swear-free zone in addition to a Biden-free zone,
Well, I'm not
Oh, that's the
sure.
other thing I want to say is that I know that we know from the tapes that Nixon swore a lot, but come on. I mean, every other word out of his mouth was, see this and it's like crazy.
I don't think he quite covered the George Carlin
No, I
list,
don't think he
but
did. He
he,
pro-
it was more of the GDs and
we don't want to say. um
but
um
I heard some of the actual tapes, and he uses some profanities, but
yeah.
I never heard the F word.
How would you? All right, we got to wrap this up because we talked a lot longer than we had thought we were going to. How would you grade the movie?
Well, I got it graded as an A. I just but mainly because I'm so into the whole Nixon folklore, and I can read the most negative slashing books about Nixon and enjoy them, and the most fawning books about Nixon and enjoy them, and the in between books. And I've listened to the tapes, and I've read Haldeman's diaries, and it's just one of those pop culture, political culture things that I'm into. So this movie is 3 hours of catnip for me. So I've got to grade it an A. I can certainly understand how it's not for everybody, but it's very inventive and it's very entertaining.
All right, I was going to give it a B minus. Give it an A. Certainly give it an A for the production. Although I didn't think it accomplished what he was really trying to show, which is that Nixon was a sympathetic figure. I didn't find him sympathetic. And I and again, I have different kind of quarrel with the history than you do. Of course, I have sort of lost my taste for Nixon over 50 years. I know this has been a disappointment to you, but once we had a real conservative president, it's like, well, what was that all about? What was so crazy about him? I mean, he was a moderate. I don't, why am I killing myself over, a moderate Republican? Um, what about if you were a high school teacher, would you show it to your class?
No, because it's rated R, I believe.
I
There's
know
too much,
you would get totally canceled showing a
there's
movie
too much profanity
too
in
much.
it, and
Plus, kids, they got. I mean, to show that to their class, they'd have to sit up. Uh, a 3 hour movie is impossible. But
right.
I might show it if I were a history professor in college. I might recommend that people look at it as a perspective, even though
I think it raises a lot of interesting issues, and you don't have to agree with all the.
no, I would. I think I'm glad we watched it, and I think it's a interesting first attempt by us. So having said that, just before we wrap up, I just want to tell the folks out there, if anyone's still listening, that this was our first podcast. So forgive any jitters or run-ons. I'm sure we'll get a little bit more succinct as we go along. Um, I did create a Facebook page called the Celluloid Presidency. If you want to go there and leave some comments or You can email me directly at garyholmes76@gmail.com, or you can tweet me at Gary Holmes. Do you have any way that people can reach you, Jim, if they care to?
Well, I'll let them contact you, and then
Okay,
you
you'll have
can,
contact me, and I will forward.
forward
Yeah,
only the good comments,
I'm
and then
sure we'll
we'll
be
be friends.
inundated. So, all right, well, join us next time for another episode of The Celluloid President.